Okay, so we're diving into some pretty intense stuff today. You sent over this collection of articles and analyses, and they're all focused on the war in Ukraine, right?
Yeah, and it's a real mixed bag, We've got everything from speculation on potential peace plans to, some pretty stark assessments of the challenges both sides are facing.
It's definitely a complex situation with a lot of moving parts, but that's what makes it so fascinating to dig into, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we even begin to make sense of all this?
Well, I think one thing that jumps out from the material is this idea of, almost a disconnect, between the way the conflict is often portrayed and what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, I see that too, especially when you look at some of the reports coming out about the Russian military. Like, the prevailing narrative in the West seems to be that they're struggling, that their forces are depleted, and that sanctions are crippling their economy.
Right. But then you dive into these articles and you see, a different picture emerging. I mean, there's analysis here that suggests Russia's actually been pretty effective in adapting its strategy, consolidating its gains, and maintaining a pretty steady supply line to their troops.
It's almost like there's a reluctance, at least in some circles, to acknowledge the effectiveness of the Russian military.
Yeah, maybe. Or maybe it's just that the situation is so complex and constantly shifting that it's hard to get a clear picture, There's definitely a lot of information warfare going on, a lot of propaganda on both sides.
Oh, absolutely. But even taking all that into account, there's still some pretty hard-hitting data in these articles, like those detailed breakdowns of Russia's logistical capabilities and their use of, pretty advanced weaponry. That's tough to spin.
Yeah, for sure. And it kind of makes you question some of the assumptions that maybe we've been operating under.
Okay, so speaking of assumptions, let's talk about Trump for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of these articles really digs into his campaign promises, specifically relating to Ukraine.
Right, and how his approach to the war, now that he's actually in office, seems to be, maybe diverging a bit from what he initially pledged.
Exactly. I mean, he promised a swift resolution, even hinted at a more, conciliatory approach towards Russia. But since taking office, it's been a different story.
Yeah, hasn't it? I mean, he's calling for increased pressure, tougher sanctions, even suggesting that, regime change might be the only way to end things.
It's a pretty stark contrast to his earlier stance.
It is. And I think the shift hasn't gone unnoticed either. Some analysts are starting to question Trump's credibility on the international stage, like, can he be trusted to keep his word, to follow through on his promises?
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's even a quote in one of the articles from this pretty well-known political commentator who basically argues that Trump's kind of, flip-flopping on Ukraine could actually weaken his position and make it harder for him to negotiate any kind of peace deal.
It's a tough spot to be in. On the one hand, he's got his domestic base, many of whom are, pretty strongly in favor of supporting Ukraine. But on the other, he needs to maintain some level of dialogue with Russia if he actually wants to find a diplomatic solution.
It's like he's caught between these two opposing forces, and it's not clear which way he's going to lean.
Yeah, and it's not just about the U.S. either, right? The whole world's watching. I mean, this conflict has the potential to really shake up the global order, impact everything from energy markets to international alliances.
Totally. Speaking of impact, we've talked about the challenges Russia is facing, but we haven't really touched on Ukraine's side of things. And one of these articles paints a pretty grim picture of their economy.
Yeah, they're hurting. I mean, their infrastructure is devastated. Key industries are disrupted. Millions of people have been displaced. It's a recipe for, frankly, economic collapse.
And it doesn't help that they were already facing economic struggles before the war even started, right? Like, their dependence on Russian energy and trade, that's got to be hitting them hard now.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how war doesn't just impact the battlefield, The ripples spread out, touch every aspect of society, and the economic fallout can be just as devastating as the physical destruction.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to acknowledge that because it's easy to get caught up in the military strategy and the political maneuvering, but we can't forget about the human cost. The everyday people whose lives are being turned upside down.
Right. And that's something we need to keep in mind as we continue this deep dive. Because it's not just about analyzing the facts and figures, it's about understanding the human stories behind them.
Totally. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about sanctions, because that seems to be a really hot topic right now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of debate about how effective they actually are.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there was this initial assumption that sanctions would cripple Russia's economy and force Putin to back down. But the reality as with most things, is a bit more complicated.
Right. Because on the one hand, we're seeing rising inflation in Russia, limited access to certain goods, some clear signs of economic pain.
For sure. But on the other hand, there's evidence that they've been able to mitigate the damage to some extent. Like, they've found ways to circumvent some of the sanctions, particularly in the energy sector.
Yeah, and there's that article that talks about how Russia has actually benefited from the increased global energy prices. So it's almost like the sanctions have backfired in some way.
Right. It's a classic example of unintended consequences,
Yeah.
You try to punish one country and you end up creating opportunities for others.
Exactly. And one of the articles even points out that China has emerged as a major beneficiary of the sanctions against Russia. They've been able to scoop up Russian resources at discounted prices and expand their influence in the region.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Almost like a geopolitical seesaw where one side's loss becomes another side's gain.
Totally. And it makes you wonder what the long-term implications of all this are going to be. I mean, is this going to shift the global balance of power? Is China going to emerge as the dominant force?
Those are the big questions, right? And honestly, I don't think anyone has the answers yet. But what we can do is keep asking these questions, keep digging into the information, and try to make sense of it all as best we can.
I agree. And that's what we're doing here, right? Trying to unpack this complex situation and make it, well, hopefully a little bit more understandable.
Exactly. And I think the more we dig, the more we realize just how interconnected everything is. The war in Ukraine, it's not just a regional conflict, it's got global implications, and it's touching every aspect of our lives, whether we realize it or not.
I think that's a great point to wrap up this part of the conversation on. We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still so much more to explore. The political landscape, the potential for peace plans, the long-term ramifications of this war. It's a lot to process.
It is. But it's important that we try, because understanding this conflict is crucial to understanding the world we live in and the world we're heading towards.
Couldn't agree more. And I'm definitely looking forward to diving into all of that in our next segment.
Me too.
Yeah.
This is shaping up to be a pretty fascinating deep dive.
Absolutely. All right, so let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and really dig into some of those bigger picture questions.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is a constantly evolving situation. And, I think it's easy to get lost in the noise,
Yeah, for sure. Like with all the propaganda and the conflicting narratives flying around, how do we even know what to believe?
Right, exactly. And I think that's where, these articles, these analyses become so valuable.
Yeah.
Because they offer I guess you could say a more grounded perspective.
Yeah, one that's based on, actual data and expert analysis rather than just, political rhetoric or media spin.
Exactly. And one of the things that really stood out to me as I was going through this material was the disconnect between, the way the conflict is often portrayed in the West, particularly in the media, and the realities on the ground.
Totally. Like there's this narrative, this idea that Russia's military is on the verge of collapse, that they're losing ground, that their morale is shattered, all because of the sanctions. But when you actually look at the situation on the battlefield, it's a different story.
It is. And the analysis in these articles, particularly the stuff about Russia's logistical capabilities and their use of advanced weaponry, well, it kind of paints a different picture.
Yeah, for sure. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, are we getting the whole story? Are we being, maybe a little too quick to buy into this narrative that Russia's losing?
I think that's a valid question. And, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the information warfare aspect of this conflict. It's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
Okay, so speaking of things that are hard to know, let's circle back to Trump for a second. Because one of these articles really digs into his campaign promises about Ukraine and, well, how his actions since taking office haven't exactly aligned with those promises.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because, during the campaign, he was all about, ending the conflict quickly, finding a peaceful solution, maybe even taking a more conciliatory approach towards Russia. But his actions since taking office have been, well, I guess you could say more hawkish.
For sure. I mean, he's ramping up sanctions. He's talking about regime change. He's even, flirting with the idea of providing Ukraine with more lethal aid.
Right. And some of the analysts in these articles are suggesting that this approach, this kind of doubling down on pressure might actually be prolonging the conflict rather than, bringing it to a quicker resolution.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that, some folks, particularly on the more isolationist side of the political spectrum, are arguing that Trump's focus on Ukraine is a distraction from more pressing domestic issues. Like they're saying, why are we getting involved in this conflict when we have so many problems here at home?
That's a valid point, And it really highlights the different perspectives that exist within the U.S., I guess you could say the foreign policy establishment, on how the U.S. should be engaging with the world.
Yeah, for sure. Like on the one hand, you have the interventionists who believe that the U.S. has a responsibility to stand up to aggressors and support democracy around the world. And on the other hand, you have those who believe that the U.S. should focus on its own interests, avoid foreign entanglements, and let other countries sort out their own problems.
Right, exactly. And I think this debate, this tension between those two viewpoints is really playing out in the way the U.S. is approaching the conflict in Ukraine.
Totally. And it's a tough one because, there are valid arguments on both sides. And ultimately, it's up to, I guess, the policymakers to decide, where they want to land on that spectrum.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance, that's for sure.
Okay, so let's shift gears again, because I want to talk about something that I think is really important, but maybe doesn't get as much attention as it should, and that's the potential for peace.
Right, because, it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day developments, the military maneuvers, the political back and forth. But ultimately, what we all want is for this conflict to end, for there to be a peaceful resolution.
Exactly. And some of these articles actually do delve into potential peace plans, or at least, frameworks for how a peace process might unfold.
Yeah, there are a few different ideas floating around out there, and some of them are pretty controversial. Like there's talk of, Ukraine declaring neutrality, forgoing NATO membership, maybe even ceding some territory to Russia.
Yeah, I saw that. And I got to say, I'm a little skeptical of those kinds of proposals. I mean, doesn't that just reward Russia for its aggression?
Well, that's the argument against it, right? That it sets a dangerous precedent, that it emboldens other aggressors, that it basically tells the world that, might makes right.
Yeah, exactly. But then you have those who argue that, sometimes you have to make tough choices, you have to compromise in order to achieve peace. And that, the alternative, a protracted war that could potentially escalate into something even worse, is just not worth the risk.
Right. And that's the dilemma, isn't it? Trying to find a balance between, standing up for principles, holding aggressors accountable, and, actually achieving a lasting peace.
Totally. And I think what makes this even more complicated is that, there's so many different actors involved, each with their own interests, their own agendas, and trying to get them all to agree on anything, well, it's like herding cats,
It is. It's incredibly complex. And I think, even if there were some kind of agreement reached, some kind of peace deal signed, the hard part would be, actually implementing it, actually making sure that all sides adhere to its terms.
Totally. And then there's the question of, what happens afterwards? How do you rebuild trust? How do you heal the wounds? How do you prevent the conflict from flaring up again?
Those are the big questions, right? And honestly, I don't think anyone has the answers yet. But I think it's important that we start thinking about those questions now, because even if peace feels like a distant prospect right now, it's important to keep that hope alive, to keep working towards it.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to recognize that, peace isn't just the absence of war. It's about creating conditions where, all parties feel secure, where their interests are respected, where they can live in dignity and have a chance to, build a better future.
I couldn't agree more. It's about addressing the root causes of conflict, the poverty, the inequality, the historical grievances, all the things that contribute to violence and instability.
Exactly. And that's a huge undertaking. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but I think it's essential that we start moving in that direction, that we start laying the groundwork for a more just and peaceful world.
Yeah, I agree. It's a long-term project, but it's one that's worth pursuing.
Totally. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground in this segment. We've talked about the disconnect between the narrative and the realities on the ground. We've talked about Trump's campaign promises and how his actions have maybe diverged from those. We've talked about different perspectives on U.S. foreign policy, and we've even touched on the potential for peace.
Yeah, it's been a pretty wide-ranging conversation, and I think we've raised some really important questions, questions that don't have easy answers.
Exactly. And I think those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking ourselves,
Yeah.
Because if we want to make sense of this conflict, if we want to understand its implications, if we want to find a path towards a better future, Well, we have to be willing to grapple with the complexity, to embrace the nuance, to really think deeply about all of this.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that's what makes these deep dives so valuable. It gives us a chance to step back from the headlines, to really dig into the issues, to have these kinds of conversations.
Totally. And I think it's also important to remember that, this is an ongoing conversation. It's not something that's going to be resolved in one episode or even in a series of episodes. It's something that we need to be constantly engaging with.
Yeah.
Constantly learning, constantly evolving our understanding.
Absolutely. And I think that's the beauty of it, the fact that there's always more to learn, always more to explore, always more to discuss.
I agree. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this exploration with you in our next segment.
Me too. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation so far.
All right. So we've talked about the current situation, but I'm really curious about what comes next. What are some of the potential scenarios that these analysts are laying out?
Yeah, the source material actually spends a lot of time on that, and there's no shortage of possibilities. Some of them are pretty optimistic, but others, well, not so much.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in those less optimistic ones. Like, what are some of the potential risks of escalation?
Well, one scenario that a few analysts highlight is the possibility of Russia expanding its military operations beyond Ukraine. I mean, some even suggest that Moldova or, Gulf, even NATO member states in the Baltics could be potential targets.
Wow, that's a pretty scary thought. But why? I mean, what would Russia gain by widening the conflict like that?
Well, there are a few different theories. One is that Russia might feel threatened by NATO's presence in Eastern Europe and see this as a way to, kind of preemptively weaken the alliance.
So it's like by trying to prevent NATO expansion, they actually end up provoking it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a risky strategy. And then there's the domestic political angle. Some analysts believe that Putin might be tempted to escalate the conflict as a way to, rally support at home and distract from internal problems.
Right, the old wag the dog scenario.
Exactly. But, that can backfire pretty easily, too. I mean, it could lead to even more international isolation and condemnation, which would just make things worse for Russia in the long run.
Okay, so what about the possibility of things just kind of dragging on indefinitely, like a war of attrition where neither side can really win, but neither side is willing to back down either?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And I think that's the scenario that a lot of people are most worried about because it would mean, years, maybe even decades of fighting with huge casualties and devastating economic consequences for everyone involved.
Not to mention the risk of the conflict spilling over into other regions.
Exactly. The longer this goes on, the greater the chance that other countries will get dragged in either directly or indirectly. And then there's the potential for miscalculation, for some kind of accident or misunderstanding that could trigger a wider conflict.
All right, like a modern-day Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. But it's a reminder that, even in the 21st century, things can escalate pretty quickly and the consequences can be catastrophic.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that was mentioned briefly in some of these articles, but I think deserves a little more attention. And that's the potential for internal instability within Russia.
Right. That's a really interesting angle because, there's this assumption that Putin has a firm grip on power, that he's basically untouchable. But I think there are some cracks starting to show.
Yeah. I mean, the sanctions are definitely having an impact and the body bags are starting to come home. How long can Putin maintain public support if things keep getting worse?
Exactly. And then there's the question of the elites, the oligarchs and other powerful figures who have benefited from Putin's rule. How long will they remain loyal if they start to see him as a liability?
Right, because their loyalty is probably more about self-preservation than ideology.
Exactly. So, if they start to believe that their interests are better served by someone else, well, things could get very interesting very quickly.
That's a pretty wild thought. Regime change in Russia, that's not something you hear people talking about very often.
It's not. But I think it's something that we need to at least consider as a possibility because the situation is so volatile, so unpredictable that, anything could happen.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of, I don't know, like a mix of awe and anxiety. Awe at just how complex and interconnected the world is and anxiety about what all of this means for the future.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty natural reaction. I mean, we've been dealing with some pretty heavy stuff here, war, sanctions, potential for escalation, regime change. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But I think it's important that we don't shy away from these conversations, because if we want to create a better future, we have to be willing to face the challenges, to understand the complexities, to really grapple with the hard questions.
Absolutely. And I think that's what we've tried to do here today to, shed some light on a really complex issue, to explore the different perspectives, to help people make sense of what's happening in the world.
I agree. And I think, even though we haven't come up with any easy answers, hopefully we've given our listeners some food for thought, some things to ponder as they continue to follow this conflict.
I hope so too. And even though we're wrapping up this particular deep dive, the conversation doesn't end here. It's important to stay informed, to stay engaged, to keep asking questions and seeking out new information.
Absolutely. Because the world is constantly changing, and we need to keep learning and adapting if we want to navigate it effectively.
Yeah.
So, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it insightful, and we encourage you to continue exploring these issues on your own. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
Well said.